If you're having problems with your septic system and you're tired of spending so much money each year to have it pumped, then SeptiClean is the answer for you. SeptiClean is an advanced specially formulated blend of bacteria used in the treatment of home and commercial septic systems. The breakdown of waste in your system relies on biological activity of naturally occurring bacteria. SeptiClean restores the natural biological process in your septic system and boosts the existing biological activity. SeptiClean is completely safe on all plumbing and can help prevent expensive emergencies in pumping. SeptiClean has approximately 6 to 100 times the bacteria count of other leading off-the-shelf brands in a 1-year supply. SeptiClean comes in a water-soluble pack, which you flush down the toilet once a month with no mess or stress. Save time, money, and maintenance on your septic system. Find SeptiClean at Emporium True Value Hardware on Main Street in Sag Harbor or visit micro-tab.com. That's micro-tabb.com. Micro-tabb.com.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played
songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made.
Those were the days. And you knew where you were then.
Girls were girls and men were men. Mister, we could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. Didn't need no welfare state.
27 minutes after the hour. That, of course, is the opening theme to All in the Family, which just hearing that theme song immediately brings back feelings of nostalgia and feelings of, I don't know, wishing America was the way that it used to be. Some feelings that are very present in America today, as exemplified by the recent political, season that we just got through. You talk about All in the Family. That was one of the many great Norman Lear shows. And I think more than anything, even though it started, I guess, more than 50 years ago, it really is emblematic of how a lot of folks see themselves. Some people see themselves in Archie. Some people see their grouchy father in Archie. Some people see themselves in Edith. Some people see themselves in Gloria or in Meathead. And especially that's relevant and you really realize that when you listen to scenes like this one from All in the Family.
You don't know nothing about Lady Liberty standing there in the harbor with her torch on high, screaming out to all the nations of the world, send me your poor, your deadbeats, you filthy. And all the nations sent them in here. They come swarming in like ants. Your Spanish PRs from the Caribbean there. Your Japs, your Chinamen, your Crouch and your Hebes, and your English fans. All of them come in here, and they're all free to live in their own separate sections. Where they feel safe, and then bust your head if you go in there. That's what makes America great, buddy.
Now, if Norman Lear had just created that show, that would be enough for him to be remembered as a TV legend. But he created Maude. He created The Jeffersons. He created Sanford and Son. He created Good Times. He created One Day at a Time. The list goes on and on. The Facts of Life. I mean, the theme songs alone should enshrine this man in every television Hall of Fame there is. When I spoke with Tony Danza recently, who said he got really his whole life on a different trajectory solely because of Norman Lear. This is what Tony Danza said on the subject of Norman Lear.
He changed TV. He really changed the way we watch TV. He changed the kind of people that were on TV. And then, you know, a lot of people don't realize this, that he flew 57 B-17 bomber runs as a radio man in World War II. So, I mean, I'm telling you, you know, like a week before he died, a friend of mine called me up and said, "Hey, Tony, I saw your friend Norman Lear." I said, "Where'd you see him?" He says, "He's in the gym on an exercise bike."
An incredible...
So that's the kind of guy he was.
An incredible guy. Yet, even though he lived to 100... there really has not been a comprehensive biography of his life and his times and his artistic work until now. It's been written by a terrific writer, author, publicist. He's been a media studies professor and the author of the new book that everybody is talking about, Norman Lear, His Life and Times. Very, very pleased to welcome its author, Tripp Whetsell. Tripp, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, Frank. I'm delighted to be here. And I tell you, you're talking about nostalgia. This really brings me home because growing up as a kid here in New York City in the 1970s and listening to 77 WABC, you know, I grew up listening to the greats like Cousin Brucey, who is back now, and Ron Lundy and Harry Harrison, listening to all the music I love. So it's because of this station. So it's really a terrific treat to be here.
That's great. It's great to have you in studio as well. All right. Everybody's talking about your book. Obviously, since Norman Lear first turned 100, and especially since he has passed away, there's been a lot of folks been talking about him. There's a lot of fans of Norman Lear out there, both regular people like me and people that work with him, people that are in television, people that are in media. Of all the things that you could write about, and I know you've written a lot about a lot of different subjects, why'd you pick Norman Lear? What fascinated you about him?
Well, I grew up in his shows. I'm 54. I grew up on his shows. I was born 2 months after All in the Family went on the air originally, and I always used to watch as a kid. Parents were watching it, grandparents were watching it. So, I just loved his shows. All of he became sort of a personal hero of mine, and I became an entertainment journalist, and always wanted to write a book on him. I mean, he was just fascinating. And how the book actually came to be is I am an adjunct professor at Emerson College in Boston, where I went to college, and Norman went to college. We have a scholarship in his name, and we have a comedy major, and we have a statue on our Boston campus. Even though I live in New York, I teach up there, and I do a class on him, the only college level class in the country where we do a deep dive into his sitcoms. It was offered to me by a terrific woman who started our comedic arts program there, a woman named Marty Cook, who I want to give a very special thank you to, and the associate provost there now, Brooke Knight, who both said let's do the class, and my agent told my terrific literary agent, Peter Ruby, told this publisher, Applause Books, about it, and said, I'd love to do a book on Norman Lear. So that's actually how the book happened. But I'd wanted to do a book on All in the Family for many years, and it had many different trajectories, but this is how it actually happened.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. So the book mentions that Norman Lear declined to be interviewed for the project. What were some of the challenges you faced writing a biography without the cooperation of your subject?
Well, it's not that he declined. He just wasn't able to really do it at that point. I mean, I didn't get the specific reason. He was approaching 100 at the time. He's been very nice to me. I want to say that he zoomed into my class twice at Emerson.
Wow!
Because he went there. He was a huge fan, and during the pandemic, as a matter of fact, as I might add. I met him a couple times. I interviewed him for my last book on the Improv Comedy Club, and I interviewed him for the 40th anniversary of TV Guide, and he wrote me a terrific letter. He was a total mensch. He just, was just busy with other things, and I just don't think he had the time. But he didn't say, I don't want him to do this book, but he was just, he just didn't have the time to do it. And his daughter, Kate, was very supportive initially. So it was challenging, of course. Any book is challenging. But I was able to talk to a lot of other people who worked on his shows, including Mary Kay Place from Mary Hartman, John Amos from Good Times, Adrienne Barbeau from Maude, Danielle Brisbois, who played Archie's niece on All in the Family, a number of the writers. So I was able to get a good cross-section of things, and there was so much out there. So it would have been great to have been able to interview Norman, but that just obviously wasn't in the cards. He just couldn't do it. So
it's been almost a year since he's passed away, and you mentioned that writing about Lear in the past tense after his death was an unexpected hurdle. How did his death impact the book's narrative and your approach to completing the book?
Well, it's interesting. I'd been working on it for 2 years, and it was sidelined a little bit because I was in a bike accident last summer out in West Hampton, where I have a place, and shattered my elbow, so it was a little slow. Last December, it's all good. I'm fine. But last summer, anyway. So last December, I was completing the book. I was out at my place in West Hampton, holed up writing it and everything like that. I was on the way back to the city, getting on the Hampton Jetney, and my phone blew up. Everyone died. Norman Lear died, and couldn't believe it. He was 101 and a half, actually, by that point. He, turned 101 on this past July, but one of those things you just thought was never going to happen. And so it was like really weird finishing the book, redoing the introduction, writing it about him in the past tense. But most of the book beyond that has already been done. I mean, I'd done most of the heavy lifting. At that point, I was at the final chapter of his life, so I was really wrapping things up.
Gotcha.
So it didn't really change that much of the book, but certainly it was. To have the subject die right as you're finishing it, a little eerie, no matter how old or young they are.
The book highlights Lear's complex relationship with his father, Herman. This is something I knew nothing about. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how that relationship, the relationship that he had with his father, shaped Lear's personal life and maybe even his professional life.
Well, sure, it shaped it tremendously. He was, Norman Lear's father, Herman, was a traveling salesman who was sort of a Willie Loman character from Death of a Salesman and prone to very, get-rich-quick schemes. This was, living in the 1930s. He was always looking for the next big buck and the next big way to be a millionaire. And unfortunately, I think greed and eagerness got the best of him. I think he was probably inherently a good guy, but just, and he ended up with some very shady characters in Boston, selling fake securities, where he went to prison for when Norman was 9 years old for like 2 years. It's Deer Island in Massachusetts. He went to prison for 2 years, and I mean, I think that shaped Norman's life enormously. Anyone's parent who gets arrested that would shape your life enormously. So I think it was a big impact. He also, around the same time, was listening to his ham radio one Saturday afternoon and heard Father Charles Coughlin, who was a very famous, known as the father of hate radio at the time, this virulent Catholic priest who was very anti-Semitic. He heard that on the radio. So those two things were really very impactful.
Well, so let's talk about Father Coughlin. And obviously, as a student of radio, I've followed, and as a student of politics, I've followed Father Coughlin's career trajectory extensively. How did that exposure to Father Coughlin impact him? How did that experience influence Lear's activism later on and his decision to establish People for the American Way?
Well, I think just hearing it at that young age, just, like anything we hear the first time, it shocks us. And I think it just stuck in his consciousness forever. He said, and there was a wonderful documentary on him in 2015 called Just Another Version of You, where he talks about it extensively, and he got tears in his eyes just talking about it. It was an American experience. It was a great documentary. And he was just gobsmacked by it, loved it, just couldn't believe how this thing experimented, and it was just so taken back by this thing. So I think it had an enormous, that, and growing up Jewish in the 1930s had a lot to do with it as well. And he was, just anti-Semitism right before the war, all that stuff that was going on in America at the time, and I think it was an amalgam that really just all impacted him, and it certainly fed his humor. Later on, what he called finding the foolishness of the human condition. It's a very famous quote of his, because he was as a kid was, one of his famous quotes, was when his father got taken to jail for what he did. His mother was actually selling pieces of furniture. They were living in Chelsea, Massachusetts at the time. He was born in New Haven. They were selling pieces of his furniture at the time, because they were going to get the hell out of, Massachusetts. And a man came up to him one time, and one of the family members and said, "Well, I guess, Norman, you're the man of the house now." And he looked at the absurdity in this. How the hell could you say this to me after what has just happened to me? And he's just like, you can find there's humor in any moment. And that was his brilliant, he was able to do that. And I talk about it in chapter 1. He was able to turn it into comedy gold. You see it all over and over again.
I love that. That's terrific. If people are just tuning in, we're talking with Tripp Whetsell. He's the author of a terrific new book called Norman Lear, His Life and Times. You painted a picture of Norman Lear in this book that goes beyond his work as a TV producer. What were some of the biggest surprises that you, as not only a student but a professor of Norman Lear, uncovered about Lear's personal life and his psyche that weren't common knowledge before this?
Well, he was just that I think that he was a human being like everybody else. I always, he was a wonderful guy, and I always put him up on a pedestal, and I loved him, and I always have great reverence for him. But he was a human guy. He wasn't always perfect. Some people said he didn't give people credit enough for his success, the success of his shows and things like that. I can't speak to that. I won't speak to that. But, you just realize he was a human person.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
Acura's all-new ADX, a compact SUV that isn't just built for one thing. It's precision-crafted for everything. To escape the grind with available all-wheel drive. To go with your flow with available Google built-in.
Hey Google, turn it up.
Okay, turning up the volume. And crafted to be heard with an available Bang & Olufsen premium sound system. The all-new Acura ADX, crafted to match your energy. Acura, precision-crafted performance.
Take your vibes and go, 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 go.
Google is a trademark of Google LLC.
We mentioned a couple of his shows, All in the Family, Maude. Great shows, still hold up today. Very controversial, especially at that time. What do you think gave him the courage to take on such controversial topics, especially when television in that era was still seen as a safe medium?
Well, it's interesting. When he did All in the Family, when he adapted it from the British show, Till Death Us Apart, which was a very famous show over there in England, he had a very long film career as a producer, doing films with Frank Sinatra, Debbie Reynolds, Dick Van Dyke. And he worked in the early days of live television for Martin and Lewis on the Colgate Comedy Hour, George Gobel, Tennessee Ernie Ford. So he had that, and he already had that big portfolio of work before that. So he was not a guy that just came out of the woods. But when he saw this show, Till Death Us Do Part, it reminded him so much of his father.
Wow.
The arguments that he used to have politically with Herman, who used to call Norman the laziest white kid he'd ever met. Used to tell his mother, Jeanette, stifled, dingbat, the things you always hear. That resonated with him so much, and it was like he wanted to do this show. I have to get this thing on the air. It was like an engine in him, basically, I think, that drove him to do it. And he, quickly went about purchasing the American rights to the show, getting it on the air. ABC, he did two pilots for ABC, beginning in '68.
Now, where was Norman's career at that time when All in the Family launched? What was he doing? How far along was he professionally?
Well, he was very far along professionally. I mean, he was not the Norman Lear that we knew. He was not he was in Hollywood. He was very, very well known, of course. And he had a huge career as a television writer in the '50s. In fact, he and Ed Simmons, who went on to produced the Carol Burnett Show, and one of the head writers for the Carol Burnett Show, who were, they were comedy writing partners, and they were two of the highest paid writers in Hollywood at the time. So they had a huge track record, and then he had a very good film career, so he was in a great place in his career. But he was itching to get back into television. he had always wanted, and when he formed Tandem Productions with Bud Yorkin in 1959, their idea was to get into the sitcom business because they wanted to own shows. Because when you were doing variety shows, it was very ephemeral. They're gone, and they don't have a lot of shelf life after that. Which is why we don't see reruns of the old variety shows. I mean, we see the Ed Sullivan Show on MeTV and stuff like that, but it's rare. You don't see one of those great old variety shows, and they were on the kinescopes too, so the quality was not that good. But they wanted to get into the sitcom business initially, and they ended up doing films. And in 1968, he was doing a film called The Night They Raided Minsky's that he shot right here in New York about an Amish girl who accidentally invents the striptease. Yeah, it was interesting. In the film, Elliot Gould was in his first TV major film role. Jason Robards was in it. It was an all-star cast that included Burt Lahr, who played the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, and he died while they were making the movie. He collapsed on the set. They thought it was pneumonia, but he'd been suffering from cancer, which people didn't know about at the time. So even though his part was a relatively small part, he was playing an old vaudevillian professor named Professor Spatz. He ended up, it was a very truncated role. They were able to save it, but Norman was itching sort of to get back into television because it was, you can get a show on the air up on its feet in so much less time than a film, of course. So that was Catalyst, and then this came along, and then the timing was really right because CBS, ABC passed on 2 pilots. The first time because they didn't think the kids were right, Mike and Gloria were right for it, and then the second time because George Schlatter had just done another show called Turn On which was on ABC that was canceled in some markets.
It's funny. I just had George Schlatter on the program not long ago, and I had not seen Turn On until I was preparing for that interview. I thought it was interesting, an interesting take on Laugh-In, but with no disrespect to George, I can understand why it was canceled.
George is a great guy, and you were doing everything. He just did a book too, I know.
Recently, that's what we were talking about.
And my dear friend Jeff Abraham, who is I have the pleasure of having as my publicist doing this book, and I'd love to give him a major shout out.
Absolutely, Jeff's the greatest.
He's terrific.
He's the greatest. So one of the hallmarks of Lear's sitcoms, including All in the Family, was pushing back against the network censors. Tell us a little bit about some of the most intense clashes he had with the networks, and maybe a story where he won a particularly hard-fought battle.
Well, by the time he got to CBS, he had a 3-picture deal with United Artists. He was doing another film called Cold Turkey. They were actually very hesitant to put it on the air. Fred Silverman championed it. He was the head of programming at the time, young guy. A new president named Bob Ward. They were looking to get rid of these shows, these rural shows like the Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres that had been, proliferating, and it was we're turning CBS into sort of the hillbilly network, as they called it at the time. So there was that, but Norman did not. But see, Bill Paley, the erudite founder of Bill Paley, who was a big part of New York society in the 50s and 60s, attended Truman Capote's Black and White Ball at the Plaza. Did not like the show. He thought it was vulgar, and so he objected to it. But they got it on the air. But they did not want to. Here's the first thing that they did was they didn't want to air the first show, Meet the Bunkers, which was the original pilot. And Norman would not change it. He said, take it or leave it. I'm not going to do a third pilot again. And they were going to do one thing that they did change was there was a scene in the original. The 2 pilots for ABC with Mike coming down, zipping up his fly on a Sunday morning. And the premise of the show was Mike and Gloria were doing an anniversary breakfast for Archie and Edith on their anniversary. And they showed just everything. I mean, it was just threadbare if you see it. It's just shocking to watch today because everything is on the table. I mean, nothing is left out. They let it all hang. And that was what Norman wants. He said, we have to get all wet at once. You can't get wetter than wet.
Like that.
And that was the thing. But at the time, there was actually they didn't know, literally until the 11th hour, they were at CBS Television City filming the 5th show, which turned out to be Judging Books by Covers, which was the episode where one of Mike's intellectual friends, who was played by Tony Gary, who was on General Hospital as Luke Spencer, Archie thinks he's gay because he's a little feminine and he's very, he's an intellectual. But then Archie's football buddy friend who played by Philip Carey, who was also in another long-running ABC soap, One Life to Live, playing Asa Buchanan, oil tycoon. He's the one that turned out to be, gay in the thing. And they were shooting that at the time that this was waiting for All in the Family to go on the air, and they didn't know whether it was going, what was going to happen. They were prepared to walk if they didn't do the original show. The show that they wanted them to air was the second episode, which was called Writing to the President, in which Archie writes his fawning letter of praise to Richard Nixon, gets dressed up in a coat and tie, and my darling Mr. President, sir. So
Lear walked away from TV at the top of his game, which is something most people would find unthinkable. What were the driving factors behind that decision, and did he ever express any regret about that?
No, I don't think he did. I mean, he never really, it's a misnomer. He didn't totally walk away. I mean, he was always involved in television to some degree to another. I mean, you mentioned those are the shows like Who's the Boss or The Facts of Life or Different Strokes. Those were done by Tandem and later Embassy Communications and TAT Communications. He was not involved in the day-to-day production of all those things. I mean, he discovered Gary Coleman in a ad because he was a young actor for a bank commercial in Chicago, and he put him in a pilot he was doing a remake of the Our Gang series, and he wanted to cast him as Alfalfa, and the show never got picked up, but he put him, basically in Good Times and The Jeffersons, but he wasn't really involved in those shows, but he really walked away from active involvement in 1978. He was very troubled by what was happening with the political discourse in the country, than the tremendous influence of the left, the Christian right, particularly Jerry Falwell, and who called him the most dangerous man in America, and Pat Robertson. And there was some really, he was just really troubled by that, and he really wanted to devote his time to that, and that was the one thing. And then he also had, the mood for his shows. I mean, in '71 when All in the Family went on the air, it was so bold and daring. I mean, nothing like this had ever been done before. And, they were still dealing with some incredibly courageous stuff in the latter seasons, as were his other shows. I mean, the 8th season alone on All in the Family, Edith's raped on her 50th birthday.
And I watched that episode still. It's very jarring.
Yeah. There's another great episode. Archie accidentally joins the KKK. Thinking it's going to be good for his bar business. He almost commits suicide when his bar almost gets. So they were doing some incredible stuff still. Shows were still great. The writers were still great. He had great writers all the way through. He always have to stack the deck with the smartest man in the room. Maud was doing great stuff. They were all doing great stuff. But the mood for that show, I mean, the novelty, I think, had worn off a bit for those shows because, Nixon, right. We'd gotten over Richard Nixon's resignation. Watergate, in 1975, Gerald Ford declared our long national nightmare officially over. Vietnam was over. So there just wasn't that voracious appetite for those shows. And then
I'm sorry, Tripp. We're just going to have to end it there, but you got to come back. Well, there's certainly a lot more to get to, and I hope people check out the book. It's called Norman Lear, His Life and Times. We've been talking with its author, Tripp Whetsell. Tripp, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Please visit my website, www.normanlearbio.com.
normanlearbio.com. A ton of good stuff on there. You can even get a copy of the book on there and learn a little bit more about it, but it's available on Amazon as well. If you want to comment, you can certainly do so. 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.
The Other Side of Midnight.